Okay, welcome to All People's Health Collective's third podcast, and also happens to be part three of our interview with John Raphling about his report on homelessness, houselessness, the unhoused, housing. All of the ways we describe it are appropriate as far as I'm concerned. And we're gonna jump right into it. We've had so much to talk about, and it's led us to a point in the conversation that I think is in some ways the most useful, which is what's being done about it, what are people saying they're doing about it, and what does that actually mean? And the thing that we all deal with when people say, well, what are the solutions? And that's often framed as a gotcha, but there are solutions. So I'm really happy to be back talking with you, John, and would love to jump into where we left off, which was us heading into a conversation about services, right?
Right. Services, and particularly one of the big services that is provided, which is shelter, interim housing, tiny homes, safe camping, whatever you want to call it. The sort of ultimately temporary non-solutions that uh, we spend a ton of money on, and that don't actually solve the problem. So, um, yeah, so we want to talk about that, and then I think once we sort of finish with that part, it leads most directly into talking about what the real solution is that, everyone who has thought seriously and studied the issue, not everyone, but
Yeah.
really knows that it is housing, keeping people in their housing, getting people back into housing.
And you just ran down a list of things that are presented as kind of quick fixes. And I think that's important to circle back to something we said in the beginning, which is that people have been presented a conversation about this issue that we feel is not only inaccurate and reductive, but kind of steers folks away from the conversation that should be happening, including this notion of quick fixes beyond what the actual solution is, which in some ways, in many ways, is not complicated. So yes, let's jump in.
Yeah, and steers conversations, and also following those conversations steers resources, which is a really critical thing. The amount of money that we spend on 8 foot by 8 foot tool sheds to stuff people in temporarily, is an astounding amount of money. Anyway, we can get to that. So
Yeah.
let me put up a screen from that we had, um, that we sort of centered the discussion starting in the last session around criminalization. And we talked about how police are involved in criminalization, most directly ticketing and arresting unhoused people, how the sanitation department is involved in criminalization, particularly the taking and destroying people's property, people who are living on the streets. But then the third component of criminalization that is sort of explained in the report is that the middle photo is the services sector, and that's, as I said last time, that's a little bit more complex, uh, um, to understand how they're involved. And so let me give let me give a little bit of an explanation. And first of all, this is not to say that the service sector, let's not use double negative. The services sector does a lot of really positive and useful things, and so I don't want to be so disparaging of the services sector, but the services sector also ends up playing a very important role in criminalization. So let me start with kind of a telling fact. Um, LAHSA, which is the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, which is a joint city and county agency, that their task is to provide services for unhoused people. And that, by services, we mean a lot of different things. At one level, it's just, getting bottles of water to people and information to them. But at the core of it is the idea that LAHSA and the outreach workers should be helping people get into housing to transition out of houselessness. And as Professor Gary Blasey at UCLA, who's like probably the foremost authority on houselessness, particularly in LA, said they're often like salespeople with no product to sell. They're out there putting people on lists for housing, but they have no housing to give. I gather that when they actually do have housing, they do a decent job of getting people, connecting people up with it because people want to get into actual housing. But so the role of the services sector is ultimately to help people transition into housing. A few years ago, the LASA board, and there's some very good people on the board, put together a basic like set of guiding principles. And the guiding principles were pretty good. And one of the key things that the guiding principles said was LASA outreach people, the services sector, should not be involved in the sweeps. Right? The sweeps are when sanitation comes and throws everyone's stuff away. They should not be involved in the project of criminalization, the policing that goes on, because obvious reasons, if you think clearly about it, right? Services outreach depends on building trust. And if you're there with the people throwing stuff away, no one's going to trust you. And the services should be about helping people, whereas the sweeps are very much about harming people. The problem is that the political leaders in the city have essentially demanded that LASA engage in the sweeps. And so they do. And I've talked to a number of LASA workers who were just torn apart by this, that they went into thinking that they were going to be doing something to help people. And every day their assignment was go out, be the first people to go up to this encampment and tell them, hey, you only got a little bit of time. You got to pack up and move. Right? That's what the services have become. Oh, and here's a bottle of water. And I've been out to many, many sweeps and we see LASA's there. And I'll ask people, hey, what did LASA do for you? Did they connect you with housing or shelter? Sometimes shelter. Sometimes they would connect people with some of the hotel rooms. I'll get to that in a minute. But often it was nothing. They just basically said we have to we have to move, or the police are going to arrest us. Why? Why would they do that? Well, let's get to on the slide that is currently showing. These are a handful of data points that are in the report, and there's many, many more. They're only giving shelter referrals at 10% of the sweeps, and only 3% of the time are people actually getting into shelter. And this is shelter, not housing. That's a really key fact. But the other thing it says on the slide, and this is kind of the game here. LASA participates in sweeps, giving them the illusion of helping. Most people at heart are decent. Most people don't want to harm people who are down and out, who are living on the streets, right? Most people in Los Angeles, and I would say in the country, want to feel like they're doing good. But people also don't want the encampments in front of their house, and they don't have the patience to wait until housing is built, and understandable. And so the politicians feel this pressure to get rid of the encampments, but they also feel a pressure to, oh, we did it humanely. And so having the services sector out there allows them to say, oh, we're helping people, which is an absolute fraud. The sweeps are not helping people. And that's really, I'd like to talk a bit about the Inside Safe, which is Mayor Bass's sort of signature program around houselessness. And it's very much about the illusion of helping people. Illusion is maybe too strong because to some extent they do help people, but they're doing this awful thing, this sweeps and criminalization, and a little bit of helping people. And the help is often in the form of shelters, which are highly problematic. Anyway, I'm going to take the slide down and maybe we can talk a little bit more about some of these other programs, and I can sort of explain what I mean by some of what I just threw out there.
Yeah, you brought up a couple questions I want to ask you and follow up with that slide you just shared and the points and the facts in that. One is just a fundamental point. When we were putting together what is now All People's Health Collective, one of the most important points of analysis for us is acknowledging the fact that reforms are fought for, reforms are won. Usually they're demands that become reforms. The deforms, Freudian slip, everyone. The reforms get co-opted by the state. Oftentimes, it's a transaction on both sides. The advocates and the state agree to this co-optation, and they turn into new departments or they turn into new bureaucracies. And pretty much every bureaucracy that sounds like it or department that sounds like it once must have been for a good reason started because people fought for it. And the history of all of these things is very interesting. But if the fundamental point that I'm getting to is that it seems, at least under the system that we live in here in this country, that these departments and bureaucracies almost inevitably end up becoming carceral. They become deputized by some function of the police state. Sanitation, we've touched on this before. Sanitation sounds good. We want our streets cleaned. We want our public space cleaned. Having somebody come pick up your trash once a week, it's never lost on me. That always just feels nice. Feels like a luxury. It's not. It's what we want in a society. Sanitation then becomes deputized in the form of these sweeps that you're talking about, that we witness, that we see every day, actually in Los Angeles and elsewhere. The same now is being said about, Lhasa. And it's funny we're talking about this now because Lhasa is obviously very much under fire right now, which we should touch on. But it applies to everything. The welfare state. The welfare state is effectively a product of people fighting to say our resources need to cycle back into us as working people. And when people are given their money back or people are given resources as a human right, everybody benefits. But we know that the welfare state, as it's set up currently, often spends more money policing welfare recipients than giving them money. They spend a lot more trying to catch people doing something wrong, to police them, to criminalize them. You and I, John, have had this experience in the past where we're doing work to stop a jail from being built or to shut down a jail. And there's always that moment in those fights where someone says, well, let's just build a new, better jail that will be more humane. And no matter how seemingly well intended that may be, although I question if it's ever well intended, they inevitably become just as sadistic and harmful and carceral as the one they were built to replace. So, this constant deputization of services is a fundamental point to, I think, our existence, where we can never simply just say, oh, we achieved a reform and now there's a department to carry out this function that's going to help people. Because if we are not constantly fighting the state to do what's right, it doesn't matter what it's called. It doesn't matter who initially staffed it. It doesn't matter if there's good people in it. It becomes something carceral. It becomes something sadistic. And it becomes something that begins being used as a tool to control folks or destabilize folks, or as you said, to be there as window dressing for something that is very harmful to people. So wanted to make that point and then wanted to follow up with a question that comes to me a lot when we talk about housing. And no one has ever really given these answers, which is folks are told, hey, we're going to put you on a list to get you housing. They don't get housing, they get shelters, or they, in most cases, get nothing. Who manages these lists, and why is it so mystified for people? And do you know?
Um, yeah, I mean, to the specific question, who manages the list? I'm not really sure. I mean, I think there is a whole bureaucracy that manages the lists, um, and a couple of key things about the list. And there's some people who have gotten on the list repeatedly. They'll tell me that, like, they have to fill out all these questions or answer all these questions that are very invasive, and that it's people expressed like feeling just abused by all of the questions that they have to answer about themselves. Like they have feeling that they have to justify who they are, um, to be on these lists, and then the lists don't don't pan out. I talked to a guy who was staying in MacArthur Park right in the lead up to um, the sweep of MacArthur Park and the renovation of MacArthur Park, where they said they housed all these people, and then when you look at their data and records, it showed that was not really the case. And there's also really bad record keeping by LASA, so it can be a little hard um, to understand any of their claims about what they've done. Um, and this guy told me, he said, look, every few weeks they come through here, and every few weeks I have been signing up every single time. I'm like, yes, I want whatever you got for me. I'll take whatever shelters you have. I want to get out of the park, get out of the tent to be somewhere, right? This guy was not even, not even like demanding like a real permanent housing. He says, I would every time I would ask when they'd come back out, I'd say, well, where am I on the list? They have no answer. Just get here, sign up for this list. He says, he even went down to the LASA office to find out and got no answers. So, and I mean, there's a lot in the news right now about inefficiencies and ineffectiveness of LASA, and certainly my experience with their data gathering, it's not good. And on the other hand, they do provide some services when they're allowed to and when they have something to provide. What's happened is the city has city policymakers have really switched their focus from permanent housing to what they call housing. And this gets to your point about this kind of the co-optation of reforms. Well, it's housing. Okay, well, when you say housing, what do you mean? Right, I remember when they were doing the Venice beach sweeps, I went down there, and they'd have like sheriff's deputies in full, like with all their weapons and like in full
And the
battle
cowboy
uniform,
hat.
going from tent to tent, asking people to sign up. And so I asked one of the deputies, I'm like, hey, what are you offering people? He says, housing. Really? What kind of housing? Like, what do you mean by housing? And he looked at me like, what are you talking about? Housing. I'm like, okay, but what? Like an apartment where you're on the lease? And here are the things that, and they have no answer. And as doing this work and talking to policymakers and listening to when they say we have housing and actually getting underneath that to what they mean. These are some of the things that they'll call housing. A safe camping spot, which is a parking lot with a painted square, like a 6 by 8 foot painted square where you can put your tent up, where you're surrounded by a fence with barbed wire and you're searched coming in and out. That they'll call housing. I mentioned the tool sheds, they call them tiny homes. An 8 by 8 shed, similarly surrounded by barbed wire, built next to the freeway, right? That before COVID, the plan was that you're sharing that 8 foot by 8 foot shed with another person, right? With shared bathrooms and all that. That's housing. Um, the abridged home shelters, where You have a cubicle, like an office cubicle that's yours. That's housing. Uh, um, None of these are housing. The hotels, right? And I think we should pivot to talking about Mayor Bass's Inside Safe program, which is about hotels, but it's basically a remake of um, the COVID era and under Mayor Garcetti, where it was called Project Room Key, where they put people in hotel rooms. Okay, well, that's a lot better than the painted square on the ground. They're calling that housing, but it's a hotel room where the security comes in and out of your room. You don't get your own key. You get searched coming in and out. You have curfews. You can't visit other people's rooms or have guests, right? That's housing, right? That's not actually housing. That's temporary shelter. That's warehousing of people. That's a good stopgap measure for people, right? When the pandemic hit, it helped certain people. Uh, um, but that's not housing and it's not a solution. And it's incredibly expensive. And takes away from actually focusing on real housing. Um, if I can, maybe can we switch over talk about Mayor Bass's program Inside
Let's
Safe?
talk.
You have a
Let's talk
question
about.
based on what I was just saying.
No, I think it's we should talk about Inside Safe. I just responding to some of what you're saying because I think you addressed the thing we mentioned in the beginning about these quick fixes. The idea of tiny homes, and I just want to talk about this for a second, only because you, me, and probably everybody else had many moments where folks brought that conversation to us. It was kind of in vogue for a moment where people thought, oh, tiny homes are the solution. And it came out of kind of an internet created fad around tiny homes in general, which, by the way, I don't look down upon. I think tiny homes, not in the context of what we're talking about, I think the tiny home movement has a lot of really interesting and really cool things about it because, um, you know, to sit and imagine all the different ways housing can look for different folks as a kind of creative endeavor is really cool actually. And some people really love to live in a very small space, something kind of primal about it for some people. Um, so there's all these different types of tiny homes that people do either as a hobby or as an alternative lifestyle. And so when the tiny home as a solution to homelessness got presented, a lot of folks imagined it as the kind of Tumblr website they had watched where somebody was showing pictures of cool tiny homes across the world and oh look at that converted circus wagon that somebody's living in Scotland, or look at this earth bag dwelling that someone's living in Taos, New Mexico, and look how cool that is. That's not what this is. You said it. These are tool sheds, 8 by 8, hastily thrown up. And I think that sometimes folks forget some of the things that maybe we all forget sometimes of the difference in living in an insulated home versus a non insulated home, let alone living next to freeways, which needs to be named more because even folks who claim to be well intended in our local government will celebrate housing stuff, and it's always right up underneath freeways, and that's just naming it. There's a lot that can be said there, but the tiny home as a quick fix to homelessness had nothing to do with the only thing it was tiny. It wasn't a home and it wasn't a solution. And I just wish more people could have actually gone and seen them. People like you and I who do this work had opportunities to go walk into some of those spaces and see what they really were. And the only difference between those tiny homes, which shouldn't be called that, and a tent is that the walls in the tiny homes were more firm. That's it. That's the only difference. And then you mentioned the painted squares in the parking lot surrounded by the fence. Somewhere in sometime in the future, I'd like to think somebody's gonna point to that and say, "Can you believe this? Can you believe that they said this was a solution?" So all of that was called out when it was happening, and it does both in some ways linear, in some ways not, lead us to what you want to talk about, which I think is really important, which is Mayor Bass's Inside Safe program. It's an extension of or new iteration of the prior program, Project Room Key. and it's happening. She's doing it less now, but for the first year of her administration, if I had a dime for every press release that came from the mayor's office about Inside Safe, I'd be able to buy everybody a house in Los Angeles. So let's talk about it. And I want to be transparent. I have family members currently in Inside Safe. So I've witnessed it firsthand. I have very charged and very strong opinions of it. And so I'm kind of, I guess, saying that as some sort of qualifier. But I want to hear from you about it and about where it falls in this, spectrum of answers or solutions to something. And is it a redirection or is it a step?
Yeah. So just to comment, and hopefully this flows into responding to the sort of last question. There are some people who were eager to get into the tiny homes, right? I talked to some people like, man, if I could get one, I would love that, right? They can be good and helpful. Part of what makes them not homes is the sort of prison camp feel that they have, right? Like you're searched coming in and out. There's no permanence. It's not, as you say, it's not a home at all. Um, and that gets to a big issue with the inside safe, right? With the hotel rooms. There's no stability to the hotel rooms. So inside safe, let me try to give like an overview of what it is. And yeah, you made the point. Mayor Bass really invested a lot of kind of her political identity in inside safe. And if you talk to her, she'll say, look, I get that it's temporary, it's imperfect. I mean, she'll say it's imperfect, but we got to get people indoors to save lives, right? And six, now almost seven people on average a day are dying of unhoused people in Los Angeles County. So that resonates, right? We've got to save lives. But here's how inside safe. So inside safe involves here's an encampment that's being targeted to be removed, right? That sounds a lot like a sweep, and it looks a lot like a sweep, and in fact, it is a sweep. We're going to remove this encampment, and we're going to make the offer to people to take them to hotel rooms. Some of them, the offer has been more of an offer. Some of it has been more of an offer you can't refuse. But we're going to sweep the encampment. Sometimes they'll put a fence around the area where the encampment was. The sweep looks like any other sweep where they're bringing in the sanitation department to throw away everybody's stuff. And the police are right there. Sometimes they've got helicopters flying over. But then you also have people from the council district doing, press looking things, people from the mayor's office, and people from the service sector, LASA or whatever other service subcontractor is out there, getting people to get on a bus and move to hotels. So in the report, we feature a particular one. It was actually the second inside safe operation. It was in Venice. And this one's very telling. So it was a Venice encampment that had been there for a long, long time that actually had a really strong support from people in the community who would actually come and bring food out to people and help them because a lot of the people in the encampment were from this Venice community that had been displaced by gentrification. But it also was the source of great anger from another segment of the community, particularly the more wealthy homeowner and business owner segment that wanted to get rid of this encampment that was a pretty large one on a street that like backed against a storage facility and the Google facility there. So the second inside safe operation, they came and they swept that location. They told people, we're gonna put you up in hotel rooms. As a pathway to permanent housing, we're gonna put you up in hotel rooms. Isn't that great? Okay. Now, you have to agree that we can throw away all your stuff except what you can keep in 2 bags, including your tent and bedding and whatever else. And so they threw away people's stuff, and they actually made people get on video saying, I consent to you throwing away my stuff. They didn't make any arrests, right? But the threat of arrest was there. And people that I talked to who were there were like, they were going to throw away my stuff. So I said, what the hell? I get on the bus. One woman I talked to was like, I get my healthcare treatment and I go to a methadone clinic right near that encampment. So I'm a little scared now that I've been moved to a hotel 16 miles away that I'm going to relapse because I no longer have access to this care that I was getting. People have jobs, right? I think I said this last time. You don't realize how many people living on the streets actually have jobs, right? Anyway, so they got moved all the way across the county and put in these very dingy hotel rooms. Okay, so great, they're indoors. Okay, and that is a help for some people, although for some people, and I looked at some of the rooms, like there's mold, there's fungus, there's uh, you know, the conditions of the place are not particularly good. Um, and they're in a very isolated place. And people have described to me across the board that the hotel rooms feel like they're in a form of jail because of the rules, because of the lack of permanence, the isolation. In many of them, you can't visit your friends in the hotel room. Some you can, um, others you can't. And then what people would complain consistently about is they were supposed to provide some kind of a pathway to permanent housing, and the services aren't there, and there's not really much of a pathway. Um, so they're sweeps based. They're moving people into a temporary and not into a very temporary situation. And they don't have a pathway to a permanent housing. So that's a basic idea of what Inside Safe is about.
Yeah, the these points these points that you make about it in some ways surfaces such an important conversation about what do people believe people deserve. There seems to be more or less consensus that people should not have to sleep on the street. But there's also this cultural force in the United States. And I only say in the United States because I don't know how it is other places, or else I would say everywhere. I'm not trying to exceptionalize anything here, positive or negative. I'm just saying what I know. And there's a really intense voice in this country that is stoked often, it's manipulated often. And the only way I can phrase it is like a jealousy, but it's something more complicated than that, a resentment. Why should they have this when I have to work for that? Why should somebody get a house? Why should somebody get a home for free when I pay so much to live in mine, or I've had to work so hard for mine? Why should so and so have a cell phone when I have to pay for mine? They don't do that as much anymore because the phones are so ubiquitous, but that used to always be the line. Look at them, they have a phone. Um, I grew up in the era where welfare reform came down from the Clinton administration, and it was so much, you know, the decade leading up to it, and especially a few years before, there was so much public narrative in the media about so-called welfare queens and people scamming the system. And that resentment is stoked all the time. And that resentment manifests so much in the dialogue about housing, where maybe there's consensus. I believe there is. People shouldn't be on the street. But you talk about Inside Safe, and I feel like Inside Safe really unveils that conversation. You mentioned that the conditions aren't good. In my personal experience, the conditions have been quite bad, to the point that I feel pretty horrified actually at the conditions in the Inside Safes I've seen. It is a step up from living on the street for the most part. But like you said, there's the jail like kind of conditions around a person not getting to have any autonomy with their emotion, with their life, with their social life. That's always been proven not to work. That mirrors the failures of the shelter system. And then it brings up that other conversation about what does a person deserve. You said how some people wanted a tiny home. Um, I knew people who also wanted one until they were in, like you said, the prison camp environment. If someone says, "Hey, here's a shed that's yours," and then you still have freedom, that's a step up from a tent, and so on and so forth. It's like it's this scale of quality of housing that is one of the I believe one of the conversations that people find most challenging to have because it brings us to the point of what do people deserve? What do you think people deserve as a person versus or along with what makes us all better off? My resentments towards people are fluid. Some days I'm a jealous hater, some days I love everybody. It really depends on other things going on in my life. What doesn't change for me is that I know if everybody has access to high quality housing and permanent housing, that we're all better off, that I live in a safer, cleaner, more stable society, and my civic reality becomes a lot better. And that's what I want, and that's what I think everybody else wants. So I believe Inside Safe is this big, like, hodgepodge, it's this cauldron where all of these questions live. And it's also was used for a time. You put that really well when you said it was a part of the mayor's political identity until it wasn't. And now we also see how these investments, and then you said this too, it didn't become that pathway to permanent housing the way it was supposed to. And these investments get disinvested in really quickly, especially if they're there only as political fodder rather than a concrete demand we're always supposed to be fighting for. And so I'm curious, what you think of two things. One, is it is it possible that these things like an inside safe, like a Lhasa, Lhasa's under attack, it's being thrown under the bus. It's very hard to defend Lhasa, but it's very easy to be wary of those attacks because it's not like these attacks are on good faith and are interested in replacing it with something better. They're interested in continuing to gut any service, any social services at all. Um, on the other hand, do these models like an inside safe, like Lhasa, are they a few tweaks away from getting us to the solutions? And also, what do we do about, and I'm not asking you to answer this like that, but more like, what are your thoughts on? So let's start with this one. What are your thoughts on that resentment politics? Because to me, that's one of the biggest obstacles to what are often otherwise simple solution oriented conversations.
Yeah. So yeah, that certainly is an ideological underpinning of criminalization, right? Like, hey, I had to work hard to get what I've got, and these people are messing it up by being out on my sidewalk rather than sort of understanding kind of the structural reasons that we talked about very much in the first segment here about the housing shortage and about the housing as a commodity and how it's left a certain number of people are going to be without housing, and it's often the people who are less able to compete in the housing market due to disability, due to discrimination, due to a variety of other things. Um, part of the part of the resentment is, oh my God, it's going to cost so much to get people in housing. And fair enough, there is a cost, right? There's always a cost. Um, just as there's a profit from housing as a commodity, there's a cost to making housing a right, but then there's a benefit to making housing a right, and that we have better, stronger, safer, healthier communities when we actually uphold these human rights that everyone should have a decent quality of life. So let me give you two sort of, I guess, data points that I think illustrate a lot of this. And then I want to get back to to what we're saying about Karen Bass and sort of the optics of it. So in the report, we looked at Inside Safe from like the very end of 2021, like December 2021 through March of 2023. So the first kind of almost year and a half, I spent something like $300 million on this. I mean, it's actually more than that. I mean, an outrageous amount of money. And breaking that down, the hotel rooms alone were on average, I forget whether it was 115 or $125 a night per person. Okay. Which works out to the total number was somewhere around 3,500 a month per person. It was somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 per month. There were a couple of different estimates in there per person for a temporary room in a dingy hotel. That's what we were spending. That's outrageous. I think I talked the first time about Project 50, a county project where they actually invested in getting sort of the hard case, most chronically unhoused people into housing with services, and it saved the county money, right? The hotel rooms are incredibly expensive and totally unsustainable. It would be one thing if it was like, we're going to get you off the street into a hotel room, you will be there for 90 days, and then we have a pathway into permanent housing, right? That might be a much more effective program. But if we're spending $300 million, and it's more than that, for temporary hotel rooms, where more people are leaving back to the streets than are going into housing, that's $300+ million that are not going into housing. So that's one, to me, just really telling and kind of outrageous data point is how much we're spending to essentially warehouse people with some but very little hope or pathway into a permanent, a real solution. Here's another data point that gets back to what you were talking about, deserves. And it's a data point. It's a bit well, anyway. A woman I know was living on the streets and was able to get a Section 8 voucher. That's a subsidy that helps her to pay rent. And the way Section 8 works, I think we talked about it before, is you pay 30% of your income for housing, and the government, the federal government, through the voucher, pays the rest. So the landlord actually gets some money because they're getting their rent, and it's affordable for you. So this woman I know fought very hard to get her Section 8 voucher, and even more importantly, fought very hard to find a place that would accept her, because one of the problems with the services sector is they have not done an effective job of helping people, once they even have vouchers, find a place. And that's a topic for a whole lengthy discussion. But when she first moved in, and moving in just changed her life. It gave her the security and the health, the ability to address all of the different issues that were going on in her life. She was able to lock her door. She was able to feel safe and take a deep breath and get a shower and do all these things that people with homes take for granted. When she started, she had very little money. So she was paying about $10 a month in rent. Government was covering the rest. Within a couple months, once she stabilized and got out there, she got a job, and shortly she was paying $1,200 a month. Right? So, and that doesn't happen for everyone. Some people, they go in and they're going to need intensive services for the rest of their lives. But a lot of people, once they stabilize and get services, the amount that we have to help them decreases. In this case, it was a very sort of obvious, you can see a linear thing. Once she got stabilized, she could get a job, she could work, she could pay more of her share of rent, causing less burden on everyone else. Sometimes it's just people need a hand. Help me up. I'll climb the rest of the way. Just get me up this first step here. And inside safe, the hotel rooms, if there was a real pathway, they could be a first step for people. And in some cases, they probably work out to being such, but mostly they're just warehousing people.
Yeah.
And
That's go ahead,
yes,
sorry.
go ahead, Lex.
No, no, no. I just the point about how most people just need the same things we all have when we are doing well, like quality housing, is, we kind of started with some of these points, but it's to me, it's the biggest lie in all of this, in the big public discourse about housing. The biggest lie is the fact is most people, and the same applies to the criminal justice system, the same applies to the mental health system, which is most people, if they have quality housing and job opportunities, or other opportunities to sustain themselves financially, don't need anything else. And the criminalization and also the kind of mass pathologizing of people are the biggest hurdles and obstacles to those outcomes. And why that happens feels insidious to me, but what gets pushed, as we know, is that it's always people saying, oh, it's because folks have substance addiction, folks have mental health issues. Now they always talk about behavioral health issues, which is a very dangerously vague term. What we know is true is that when you have a good or decent place to live and you can pay your bills, you're going to do very well. And we've seen this play out over and over again. Diversion programs where people are steered away from jail and into housing that's high quality and permanent. The recidivism rates are almost non-existent versus people who are consistently put through the court systems, and the recidivism rates are astronomical. If one wanted to apply the idea of recidivism to being unhoused, it's the same. And so I think I just wanted to re-stress that point, because so often people imagine everybody needs all this specialized care and all these specialized resources. And there are some people who do, just like there are some people who come from wealthy backgrounds who live in nice neighborhoods who also need those specialized resources on account of their mental health issue or other issues they deal with. That's all. I was just feeling compelled to kind of emphasize that, re-emphasize that, because it's such a intentionally overlooked part of the answer.
Yeah, no, very much a fact. And if you actually look at, study, talk to the people who are um, actually doing housing programs that get people in permanent housing, particularly supportive housing for people who have higher needs. The success rates are phenomenal. They're like 90+%. And when you compare that to more people are leaving the hotel rooms than are getting housed, more people are returning to the streets. Um, where should we put our investment in our communities? Unfortunately, people see the warehousing and the sweeps as a quick fix, and much of it is um, guided by this sort of political need to look like you're doing something, and that gets back to all of the um, press releases and tweets about, look at us, we've cleared this corner here, right? And they chose the particular encampments based on the optics, right? Well, this encampment is getting the most complaints from the neighbors, so we're going to remove it, as opposed to, if they really wanted to save lives, we're going to identify the people who most desperately need to get indoors to save their lives and put them there. So it's actually been quite a cynical program, and all the more cynical when we see how much money is wasted when we know the solution is to keep people in housing and to get people from the streets into housing.
And it begs a more complicated question, just for us to all, me, you, and whoever's, watching and listening to this, which is there a desire on the part of folks having a different experience and perhaps who have had a more privileged experience. When the answers are in plain sight, when we see how successful people can be, when I talked about the politics of resentment and jealousy, is there also a politic, if you will, of insecurity? Does it make you nervous to see how successful people can be? Does it make you feel less special or something, or less endowed by the fates and the gods of being in a better position than they are, knowing that if they have even a basic version of what you have, a fraction of what you have, they can thrive and be quite successful? Is some of this constant the punitive additions to these already not very good so-called solutions of an inside safe, of a tiny home, of a shelter, then they add all these punitive measures on top of that? Is that intentional? Is it an intentional kind of destabilization of people? Is it an intentional setting people up to fail? Is it an intentional punishment for being poor, if you will, or an intentional act to kind of reinforce this class status quo that you're comfortable with, that you otherwise would never want to say? And I'm just offering that as a question because there's manifold answers, I'm sure, but it's important to consider because as we've been hinting at the whole time, and now where I want to finish with, and I'm going to ask you, is there are answers and they're not complicated. And so, yeah, let me do my impersonation of like you're on a panel on CNN. Okay, there's 3 minutes left, John. What's the answer to homelessness?
Yeah, well, so read the recommendations in the report. There's a lot of answer. Um, First, stop the cruelty, right? Stop the sweeps and the criminalization. It's wastefully expensive. It's harmful. It's making the problem worse. Like if there's no other takeaway, it's like, let's not do that, right? We can do cleanups that are actually cleaning up, but that aren't stepping on people's throats when they're already down. Second is let's figure out ways to, rather than invest in sweeps and invest in these sort of temporary non-solutions, and rather than invest in shelters that go nowhere, let's invest our collective resources in getting people into housing. And there's a lot of creative ways, to do that. LA Can is building the Eco Hoods development, as a way to house people in like real housing that is much less costly than sort of usual. There's lots of experiments and ways to do that with housing. We need to also have this fundamental rethinking of things like housing and healthcare, and look at them, and education for that matter, and look at them as these are beneficial for everyone. If everybody has healthcare, housing, a decent quality of life, it's like having good sewage system, right? It's like it helps everybody. If some people don't have a good sewage system, then disease is going to spread, and it's not going to stop at your door, even if you have it, right? Like it's a benefit to everyone if we all have a baseline quality of life, and that's worth the expense. And in fact, it ultimately is probably less of an expense than all of these
That's right.
ineffective uh, fake measures. And to your point about intentions, I think there's a broad spectrum. There are some people who have genuinely malign intentions. But I think most people would like to see the problem solved, and would like and but don't necessarily understand the options. And one of the things that I've long said is, if we remove criminalization from the table, right? Like this is no longer an option. You cannot do it. You cannot ticket people for living out there. Well, then that's no longer something that we look at, so we can actually look at real solutions. And so I guess the takeaway is, let's knock off the criminalization, take that tool out of the toolbox, to use the language that many proponents use, that it's a tool they need, and so that we can actually use the right tools to solve this problem. And the basic right tool is we should have some collective humanity and realize that your fate is tied to mine, and if you're living on the streets, it's going to impact me negatively as well. And so let's make sure we help each other through it.
That's it's a really great note to end on. I feel really grateful to continue to have this dialogue with you. We're going to be building on this dialogue. This is the beginning of much, much more for us to explore something that's very interesting, which is the solution may be simple, getting to the solution is complex. And that's because we're all choosing to collectively be complex about it. And digging in on that is going to be such an important part of the fight and of the work. Not all of it has to be a fight. So, once again, thank you, John Raphling from Human Rights Watch, who delivered this amazing report. We will continue to amplify the report. It's for everybody to read, and much more to come. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lex. Great having a chance to talk with you.